The sun had not yet risen over the coastal training grounds, but the air was already thick with the smell of salt spray and old sweat. For the 30 candidates standing in a perfect line on the asphalt, the world had shrunk down to the few inches of space between their boots. Among them stood a woman named Lena. She was lean, her hair cropped short, and her face was a mask of exhausted concentration. To anyone watching from the outside, Lena didn't belong there. The grinder, as the instructors called the massive concrete courtyard, was a place where dreams went to die. For 3 weeks, Lena had been the resident ghost of the class. She wasn't loud, she wasn't arrogant, and most notably, she wasn't winning. In fact, she was barely surviving. "Down! Recover! Down! Recover!" The lead instructor's voice cut through the morning mist like a serrated knife. It was a rhythmic, soul-crushing cycle of burpees and mountain climbers. To the left of Lena, a former college track star was moving like a machine, his movements crisp and explosive. To her right, a powerhouse athlete from the Midwest was powering through the reps without breaking a sweat. Then there was Lena. Her movements were heavy. Her transitions were slow. Every time the whistle blew for a sprint, she was the last one to cross the line. She wasn't just slow. She seemed to be struggling with the very mechanics of the drills. When they did the obstacle course, she fumbled the rope climb. When they ran the miles in the soft sand, she finished minutes behind the pack, her lungs wheezing. "Are you trying to set a record for the slowest human on Earth, Candidate 24? The instructor roared, standing inches from Lena's face. A vein was pulsing in his neck. "This is an elite program. My grandmother moves faster than you, and she's had 2 hip replacements." Lena didn't look at him. She didn't roll her eyes or offer an excuse. She just stared straight ahead, her chest heaving. "No, instructor," she rasped. "Then move." But she didn't move faster. She couldn't. Her body seemed to have a ceiling that was much lower than everyone else's. By the time the breakfast whistle blew, the rest of the candidates were already heading toward the mess hall, whispering among themselves. They didn't hate Lena, but they resented her. In a world where the team is only as strong as its weakest link, Lena was a heavy chain dragging behind them. Up on the observation deck, a man watched the scene through a pair of binoculars. This was Commander Reed. He wasn't like the shouting instructors on the ground. He was quiet, his face weathered by decades of missions that officially never happened. He had seen thousands of candidates come through these gates. He knew the stars usually quit when things got boring, and the meatheads usually quit when things got too technical. Reed lowered his binoculars and looked at the clipboard held by a junior officer standing next to him. "She failed the timed run again, sir," the officer said, shaking his head. "She's bottom of the list on the swim, the obstacle course, and the strength test. The instructors want to drop her by noon. She's a safety liability at this point." Reed didn't answer immediately. He watched Lena as she walked toward the cafeteria. She was limping slightly, but her gait was steady. Most people who failed that many drills walked with their heads down, their shoulders slumped in shame. Lena's head was up. She was observing the perimeter, looking at the way the wind moved the grass, noticing the position of the guards at the gate. "Look at her heart rate data from the stress test," Reed said. The officer flipped through the pages. "It's weird, sir. It's consistent. Even when she's failing, even when the instructors are screaming in her ear, her heart rate stays at a steady 65 beats per minute. It's like she's bored, or like she's waiting," Reed whispered. Back in the mess hall, the atmosphere was cold. Lena sat at the end of a long wooden table. A candidate named Vance, a man who had finished first in every drill that morning, sat down across from her. He didn't look happy. "You should just ring the bell," Vance said, his voice low so the instructors wouldn't hear. "You making us look bad." Every time you fail a drill, the whole squad has to do extra push-ups. It's not fair to the rest of us who actually put in the work. Lena took a slow bite of her oatmeal. She looked at Vance. Her eyes were a piercing, calm gray. The drills aren't the job, Vance, she said quietly. Vance scoffed. The drills are everything. If you can't pass a simple obstacle course, how are you going to carry a teammate out of a hot zone? If you can't run a 6-minute mile, how are you going to keep up when the bullets start flying? Running in a circle on a track isn't the same as moving through a city, Lena replied. She didn't sound defensive. She sounded like she was stating a mathematical fact. Vance shook his head and walked away. You won't last the week. The afternoon didn't go any better. The candidates were taken to the drown-proofing pool. This was a test of mental grit, where their hands and feet were tied and they had to bob in the water for 20 minutes. It was terrifying for most. People panicked. They splashed. They had to be pulled out by divers. Lena didn't panic. But she didn't look good either. She struggled to stay vertical. She took in a mouthful of water and coughed violently. She looked like she was drowning for the entire 20 minutes. The instructors were hovering over her with poles ready to fish her out. She's done, the junior officer said to Reed on the deck. She's failing the basic survival mechanics. Reed leaned over the railing. He saw Lena's face as she broke the surface for a breath. While everyone else was gasping and looking for the exit, Lena was looking at the clock. She wasn't fighting the water. She was calculating exactly how much energy she needed to use to stay alive for one more second. She was doing the bare minimum to survive, but she was doing it with terrifying precision. When the whistle finally blew, Lena crawled out of the pool, shivering. She was blue around the lips. She had technically passed, but it was the ugliest pass in the history of the program. That evening, the instructors gathered in the briefing room. On the wall was a list of names. Lena's name had a bright red circle around it. She's a hazard, the lead instructor argued. The men don't trust her. She has no physical dominance. If we send her into the final phase, she's going to get someone hurt. I want her gone tonight. The room went quiet as Commander Reed walked in. He tossed a folder onto the table. Inside were Lena's records from before she joined the program. There wasn't much there, just a background in linguistics and a brief stint in a high-pressure corporate security firm. You all see a failing athlete, Reed said, his voice calm but heavy. You see someone who can't climb a rope or run a sprint. You're looking at the exterior. You're testing her muscles. Sir, this is a physical job, the instructor countered. It is a mental job that requires a body, Reed corrected. And I think we're testing the wrong things. Tomorrow, we move to the final phase. I'm taking over the evaluation personally. The instructors looked at each other, confused. The final phase wasn't supposed to happen for another 2 weeks. I'm going to give her a test, Reed said, a small, mysterious smile playing on his lips. A real one. If she fails, I'll personally escort her to the gate. But if she does what I think she's going to do, the rest of you are going to realize you've been looking at the most dangerous person in this room and calling her a failure. The next morning, the candidates were woken up at 3 a.m. by the sound of flashbangs. But instead of the usual workout clothes, they were told to put on full gear. They weren't going to the grinder. They were being loaded into a windowless truck. As the doors slammed shut, Lena sat in the dark, feeling the vibration of the engine. Beside her, Vance was checking his watch, his hands shaking slightly from the adrenaline. Lena, however, leaned her head back against the metal wall and closed her eyes. She wasn't nervous. For the first time since she arrived, she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The test was finally beginning. The heavy metal doors of the transport truck swung open with a deafening bang. letting in a blast of cold, damp air. It was still dark, but the faint glow of distant streetlights revealed they were no longer on the manicured grounds of the training base. They were in the middle of an abandoned industrial park, a maze of rusted shipping containers, crumbling brick warehouses, and narrow, shadowed alleys. The candidates tumbled out, their gear rattling. They were exhausted, their muscles still screaming from the previous day's failures, but the adrenaline of the unknown kept them standing. "Listen up," the lead instructor barked, his voice echoing off the metal walls. "This is a land navigation and retrieval exercise. You have a GPS coordinate and a physical description of a high-value package. You have 90 minutes to find it and bring it to the extraction point. If you are spotted by the enemy patrols, which are played by our seasoned staff, your entire team fails. Speed is important, but silence is life." Vance, the star athlete, immediately stepped forward, taking charge. He grabbed the map and the GPS device. "All right, listen to me," he whispered to the group. "We move fast. We stay in a tight diamond formation. If we see a patrol, we sprint for cover. We've got the best runners in the unit right here. Let's move." Lena stood at the back of the group. She adjusted the straps of her heavy vest, making sure nothing would jingle or catch on a loose wire. She watched Vance and the others. They were checking their watches, bouncing on their toes, eager to use their legs. They looked like racehorses behind a starting gate. "Vance," Lena said softly. Her voice wasn't loud, but it had a steady quality that made a few people turn around. "The direct route on that map goes through 3 open intersections with high vantage points. If there are patrols, they'll be sitting on those roofs. We should go through the drainage pipes on the east side." Vance didn't even look back. "The pipes are a mile out of the way, and they're half flooded. We don't have time to crawl through mud." Candidate 24. "We have 90 minutes. We run. That's the drill." "This isn't a drill," Lena muttered to herself, but she followed. For the first 20 minutes, Vance's plan seemed to work. The group moved with incredible speed. They leaped over low walls and sprinted across open lots with the grace of professional athletes. Lena, as usual, was struggling to keep the pace. She was breathing hard, her boots thudding heavily on the pavement. "Keep up, or drop out," one of the other candidates hissed at her as she lagged 10 feet behind. Suddenly, a red searchlight cut through the darkness from the top of a warehouse. "Freeze!" Vance whispered, diving behind a trash bin. The group huddled together, their hearts hammering against their ribs. The searchlight swept slowly across the pavement, missing them by inches. The enemy was a pair of instructors in a jeep, driving slowly down the main road. They were wearing night vision goggles and holding thermal scanners. As soon as they passed the corner, "We sprint for the next building," Vance commanded. "On 3. 1, 2, 3, go." The group exploded into motion. They were fast, extraordinarily fast. But speed creates noise. The sound of 12 pairs of heavy boots hitting the asphalt sounded like a drum roll in the quiet night. The jeep stopped. A siren wailed for a split second, the signal that they had been detected. "Halt! You're dead!" a voice boomed over a megaphone. The candidates stopped in their tracks, shoulders sagging. They had been in the exercise for less than 30 minutes, and they had already died. From the shadows, Commander Reed appeared. He wasn't wearing a uniform. He was in a simple dark jacket, looking like a ghost in the mist. He walked up to the group, his eyes scanning their faces. He stopped in front of Vance. "You're fast, son," Reed said. "But you're loud. You're thinking about the clock. In the real world, the clock doesn't kill you. The guy you didn't hear coming kills you." Reed turned his gaze to Lena, who was standing a few feet away from the group. She wasn't standing with the others. She had instinctively backed into the shadow of a doorway the moment the siren went off. "Reset," Reed ordered. "Back to the start. You have 60 minutes now. And this time, if you're caught, there are no second chances. You're out of the program. The pressure shifted. The fun of the exercise vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp fear. They hiked back to the starting point in silence. Vance looked rattled. His confidence was shaken because his physical gifts had failed him. "The pipes," Vance said, his voice tight. "We'll take the drainage pipes like she said." They found the entrance to the pipes, a dark, cramped tunnel filled with 6 inches of cold, stagnant water. One by one, the elite athletes crawled in. It was miserable work. The space was too small for their large frames. They bumped their heads, scraped their knees, and complained about the smell. Lena, however, moved through the pipe with a strange, fluid ease. She was smaller than the men, and she didn't seem to mind the mud or the cold. While the others were focused on their discomfort, Lena was tilted her head, listening to the echoes in the pipe. "Stop," she whispered. Vance, who was leading, froze. "What?" "We're losing time." "Listen," Lena said. Far above them, through a metal grate in the ceiling of the pipe, they heard the low hum of an engine. It was the patrol jeep, idling right above their heads. If they had continued moving, the sound of their splashing would have been heard through the grate. They waited in total silence for 5 minutes. The water was freezing, and several of the men started to shiver uncontrollably. Their teeth were literally chattering a sound that could give them away. Lena reached out and put a firm hand on the shoulder of the man in front of her. She leaned in and whispered into his ear, "Control your breath. Slow it down. Focus on the heat in your chest." She passed the message back. It wasn't an order. It was a technique. Slowly, the shivering stopped. The group settled into a state of forced stillness. When the jeep finally moved off, they continued. They reached the end of the pipe and emerged into the heart of the industrial park. The GPS indicated the package was inside a 3-story office building. "I'll go first," Vance said, trying to regain his leadership. "I'll scout the lobby." He crept toward the glass doors of the building. He was being careful, but he was still moving like an athlete. He was looking for obstacles, not for people. He was still moving like an athlete. He was looking for obstacles, not for people. He didn't see the thin, nearly invisible tripwires stretched across the entrance. Lena's hand shot out, grabbing the back of Vance's vest and yanking him backward just as his boot was an inch from the wire. Vance stumbled back, his eyes wide. He looked at the wire, then at Lena. He was trembling. "I didn't see it. You're looking for things to jump over," Lena said quietly. "Look for things that shouldn't be there." She knelt down, took a small pair of multi-tools from her pocket, and spent 30 seconds carefully neutralizing the wire. She didn't rush. She didn't look at her watch. She worked with the steady hands of a surgeon. They entered the building. It was a labyrinth of cubicles and dark hallways. The air was still. "We have 10 minutes left," someone whispered. "We have to hurry." The group started to break formation, panicking as the deadline approached. They began opening doors at random, looking for the package. The noise level rose again. "Wait," Lena called out. But it was too late. A door at the end of the hall swung open, and the floodlight hit them. 3 insurgents in tactical gear stood there with training rifles raised. "Gotcha," one of them grinned. The candidates froze. It was over. They had failed the retrieval. The weight of the failure hit them like a physical blow. Vance dropped his head into his hands. They had been so close, but they had let the pressure of the clock push them into a trap. But then, a voice came over the instructors' radios. "Check your 6, the voice said. It was Commander Reed. The instructors turned around. Standing behind them, having come through a ventilation shaft no one else had noticed, was Lena. She wasn't holding a weapon. She was holding a small black box, the package. She had slipped away from the group the moment they entered the lobby. While they were busy being loud and distracted in the hallways, she had mapped the building's layout in her head, found the most logical place for a high-value item, and took the impossible route to get there. The instructor stared at her. She was covered in dust and cobwebs, her face streaked with grease. She looked exhausted, but her eyes were as calm as a still lake. "Time?" Lena asked. Reed walked out from a side office, checking his stopwatch. "You have 4 minutes to spare." He looked at the rest of the group, the fast runners, the weightlifters, the perfect candidates. They were all breathing hard, sweating, and defeated. Then he looked at Lena, who had failed every physical drill for 3 weeks. "The rest of you go back to the truck," Reed said. "Candidate 24, stay here. We need to have a talk about who you actually are." The sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, casting long, thin shadows across the concrete floor of the warehouse. The rest of the team had already shuffled out toward the transport truck, their boots dragging in the dirt. They were silent, the weight of their near failure hanging heavy in the air. Lena stood alone in the center of the vast empty room, still holding the small black box. Commander Reed walked toward her. He didn't have the angry, barking energy of the other instructors. He moved with a quiet authority that felt much more dangerous. He stopped a few feet away and shoved his hands into his pockets. "You're a puzzle," Reed said, his voice low. "My instructors think you're a ghost who got lucky. They see your scores on the track and they see a girl who's going to get people killed in a real fight. But I saw how you handled that tripwire. You didn't just see it, you anticipated it." Lena didn't look proud. She just looked tired. "If you're hunting someone, you don't put a trap where it's easy to hide. You put it where people are most likely to run." Vance was running. Reed nodded slowly. "Vance is an athlete. Most people who come here are athletes. They've spent their lives winning trophies because they can push their bodies harder than anyone else. But this job isn't a trophy room. It's a chess match where the board is constantly catching on fire." He stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "Why are you failing the physical drills? I've seen your files. You aren't sick and you aren't lazy. So why are you always last?" Lena hesitated. She looked down at her hands, which were covered in scrapes from the drainage pipe. In a drill, everyone knows when the whistle is going to blow. They know exactly how far the finish line is. They use 100% of their energy because they know they get to rest when it's over. She looked up at him. "In the real world, I don't know where the finish line is. I don't know if I'll have to run for 5 minutes or 5 days. If I give 100% in the first mile just to look good for a stopwatch, I'm empty when the real trouble starts. I don't train to win drills, Commander. I train to have something left in the tank when everyone else is dry." Reed stared at her for a long beat. It was a philosophy he hadn't heard in years, the mindset of a true survivor, not a competitor. "The problem," Reed said, "is that the brass doesn't care about your philosophy. They care about standards, and according to the standards, you're out." "Unless what?" Lena asked. "Unless what?" Lena asked. "Unless we change the game," Reed said. The next phase was supposed to be a survival trek through the forest. Standard stuff. Land nav, building fires, eating bugs. But I'm bored of that. I want to see how you handle a scenario where there is no right answer." He turned and started walking toward the door. "Get in the truck. You're not going back to the barracks. We're going to a place called the Gray Zone." The Gray Zone was a mock village built in a remote valley. It was designed to look like a small town in a conflict-heavy region. complete with a marketplace, a town square, and a network of two-story buildings. When the truck arrived, the candidates were told they wouldn't be working as a team this time. Each of them was given a different role. Some were civilians, some were guards, and one was the target. Vance and the other top athletes were given the role of the assault team. Their job was simple: find the target and extract them within 2 hours. Lena was given a different task. Reed pulled her aside and handed her a simple brown shawl and a basket. "You're a local villager," Reed told her. "You have no weapon. You have no radio. Your goal is to move the target, who is another instructor, out of the village without the assault team seeing you. If they catch you, you fail. If they catch the target, you fail." Vance smiled when he heard the rules. To him, this was easy. He had the high-tech gear, the numbers, and the speed. He figured he could just sweep the village block by block and find them in 20 minutes. The exercise began. Lena entered the village from the north. She didn't hide in the shadows or crawl through the dirt. Instead, she put the shawl over her head and walked right down the middle of the street. She moved slowly, her shoulders slightly hunched, mimicking the gait of someone who had spent their whole life carrying heavy loads. She looked invisible because she looked like she belonged there. From a rooftop, Vance was scanning the streets with binoculars. He saw Lena, but his brain immediately skipped over her. He was looking for threats: people with guns, people running, people looking suspicious. A woman with a basket didn't register as a threat. Lena reached the safe house where the target was waiting. The target was a large man named Miller, a former linebacker who looked nothing like a villager. "How are we doing this?" Miller whispered, checking his watch. "Vance's team is already moving into the south sector. They're fast. They're too fast," Lena said. "They're looking for a fight, so we aren't going to give them one. Put this on." She handed him a tattered coat and a hat. "And stop walking like a soldier. You're too stiff. Look at the ground, not the corners." As they stepped out of the house, the sound of heavy boots echoed from the next street over. Vance's team was performing a dynamic entry on a nearby building, kicking in doors and shouting commands. The noise was a beacon telling everyone exactly where they were. Lena didn't run away from the noise. She walked toward a group of other role-player civilians who were sitting near a well. She whispered something to them, and they began to move around, creating a small crowd. Vance's team rounded the corner, their plastic training rifles raised. They were sweating, their movements frantic. "Clear! Clear!" they yelled, moving past the well. Vance looked right at Lena and Miller. He saw two people standing near the well, partially obscured by the crowd. But because they weren't running, his brain dismissed them. He was so focused on finding a hidden enemy that he couldn't see the one standing in plain sight. "Move! Check the church," Vance ordered his men. They sprinted off, their heavy gear clanking. Lena waited until they were a block away. Then she turned to Miller. "Now we move." Through the marketplace. They were halfway to the exit when Commander Reed threw a curveball. He signaled over the loudspeaker that a riot had broken out in the square. Suddenly, the role players began shouting and pushing. Smoke grenades went off, filling the air with thick, white clouds. Vance's team panicked. This wasn't in the briefing. They started trying to control the crowd, using their physical strength to push people back. They were getting frustrated, their tempers flaring as the civilians ignored their orders. In the middle of the chaos, Lena grabbed Miller's sleeve. She didn't push. She didn't shout. She watched the flow of the crowd like she was watching a river. She found a small gap between two buildings and slipped through, pulling Miller with her. They reached the perimeter fence, the finish line, with 30 minutes to spare. Lena sat down on a rock, taking off the shawl. She wasn't breathing hard. She wasn't sweating. She looked like she had just gone for a stroll in the park. 10 minutes later, Vance and his team arrived. They were exhausted, their uniforms torn, and they were arguing with each other about what went wrong. When they saw Lena and Miller already sitting there, the silence was deafening. Vance walked up to Lena, his face red. "Where were you? We searched every building in the north sector." "I was at the well," Lena said simply. "You looked at me 3 times." Vance opened his mouth to argue, but Commander Reed stepped out from the trees. He was holding a tablet that showed the recorded footage from the village cameras. "She's right, Vance," Reed said. "You walked right past her. You were so busy looking for a drill that you forgot to look for the person. You have the best muscles in this program, but you have the loudest mind I've ever seen." Reed turned to Lena. The coldness in his eyes had thawed just a little bit. "You passed, but don't get comfortable. Tomorrow we stop playing games. Tomorrow I'm taking you to the high-altitude range. And there your patience might just be the thing that breaks you." Lena nodded. She knew the real test was still coming. The commander wasn't just testing her skills anymore. He was trying to find her breaking point. The air at the high-altitude range was thin and biting. Up here, the wind didn't just blow. It seemed to push against you like a physical hand. The candidates stood on a jagged ridge, shivering despite their thick thermal layers. Below them lay a sprawling valley of gray rock and patches of old, frozen snow. This was the dead zone, a place where the lack of oxygen made the simplest tasks feel like hauling a truck uphill. Vance and the others were already struggling. Even the strongest athletes were finding that their muscles burned twice as fast in the thin air. They were gasping, their faces pale, trying to maintain the tough guy image while their bodies revolted. Commander Reed stood before them, looking as steady as the mountain itself. "Today isn't about stealth, and it isn't about speed," he said, his voice carrying over the wind. "Today is about stealth, and it isn't about speed," he said, his voice carrying over the wind. "You'll carry a 70-pound pack from this ridge to the valley floor. Once you're there, you'll receive a set of coordinates. If your gear breaks, fix it. If your teammate falls, carry them. There is no finish line until I say so." Lena adjusted her pack. She felt the weight pressing into her shoulders, but she didn't fight it. She knew that if she tensed up, she would tire out in 10 minutes. She let her body go loose, finding a rhythm in her breathing that matched the slow, steady beat of her heart. The descent began. It was brutal. The loose shale under their boots turned every step into a gamble. Within the first hour, one of the candidates slipped, twisting his ankle with a sickening pop. Vance immediately rushed over, trying to hoist the man up. Vance was strong, but the extra weight in the thin air was crushing. After only a few hundred yards, Vance was doubled over, his chest heaving. "Let me take a side," Lena said, stepping in. "I've got it," Vance snapped, his pride stinging. "Just stay in the back where you belong." Lena didn't argue. She simply stayed close. 20 minutes later, when Vance's legs began to shake uncontrollably, she didn't wait for permission. She reached in, looped the injured man's arm over her shoulder, and took half the weight. She didn't sprint. She didn't stride a lead. She just moved like a slow, steady tide, one foot after the other. By the time they reached the valley floor, the sun was high and the heat was bouncing off the rocks. The cold morning had turned into a sweltering afternoon. This was the trap. Most people prepare for the cold or the heat, but few are ready for both in the same day. The junior officer met them at the coordinate point. He looked at his watch. "You're behind schedule. New orders, the extraction point has been moved 5 miles north. Also, your radios are now officially dead. You have to navigate by the sun and the terrain. A groan went up from the group. 5 miles in this terrain felt like 50. "We go north," Vance shouted, pointing toward a distant gap in the hills. "Double time! We have to make up for the delay." The group started to move, but they were sloppy. The heat was making them irritable. They were bickering about who was carrying the most weight and which way was truly north. In the chaos, they didn't notice that the clouds were beginning to pile up behind the peaks, dark, heavy clouds that smelled of a coming storm. "Vance, wait!" Lena called out. She was looking at the birds. They were staying low, tucked into the crevices of the rocks. "The weather is turning. If we go through that gap, we'll be trapped in a funnel when the wind hits. We should stay low and head for the tree line." "The tree line adds 2 miles," Vance yelled back, not stopping. "The mission is north. I'm going north." The team followed the leader. Lena followed the team, though her gut told her they were walking into a disaster. 30 minutes later, the mountain decided to show its teeth. The wind didn't just pick up. It exploded. A wall of dust and freezing rain slammed into them, reducing visibility to nearly zero. The temperature plummeted 40 degrees in minutes. The funnel Lena had warned about acted like a vacuum, pulling the freezing air through the gap at a terrifying speed. The candidates were blown off their feet. The injured man was screaming in pain as he was tossed against the rocks. The star athletes, the ones who could run miles on a track, were suddenly useless. They were freezing, blinded by the dust and paralyzed by the sudden shift from a training exercise to a fight for survival. "Get down!" Vance was shouting. But his voice was lost in the roar of the wind. He was spinning in circles, lost in the whiteout. Then he felt a hand on his collar. It was firm and calm. "Follow my voice," Lena yelled into his ear. She didn't try to stand up against the wind. She stayed low, almost crawling. She had noticed a small overhang of rock, a natural cave, just before the storm hit. She hadn't been looking at the finish line. She had been mapping the safety points. One by one, she grabbed the candidates by their vests and guided them into the crawl space. It was cramped and smelled of wet earth, but the wind couldn't reach them. Inside, the silence was jarring. The men were shivering, their faces covered in dirt and tears. Vance sat in the corner, his head in his hands. He was the strongest man in the room, yet he had nearly led them all off a cliff because he was too focused on the clock. Lena didn't lecture them. She opened her pack and pulled out a small, battered metal tin. She had packed extra space blankets and a small stove, items that weren't on the required list because they added weight. The athletes had left theirs behind to be faster. Lena had carried the extra 70 pounds of just in case. She handed a blanket to the injured man and started the stove. The small flame provided a tiny circle of warmth that felt like a miracle. "How did you know?" Vance asked, his voice cracking. "How did you see the storm coming when the rest of us didn't?" "I wasn't looking for the end of the mission," Lena said, her voice steady as always. "I was looking at the world." The birds stopped singing. The wind changed direction. If you only look at the goal, you miss the things that are trying to stop you from getting there. For 3 hours, the storm raged outside. Inside the cave, the power dynamic of the group shifted forever. They didn't look to Vance for orders anymore. They looked to the woman who had failed the drills, but knew how to survive the reality. When the wind finally died down, they crawled out. The world was covered in a thin layer of ice. Standing 100 yards away, leaning against a jeep that had survived the storm, was Commander Reed. He had been watching the whole thing on a thermal feed from a drone. He didn't say good job. He didn't offer them a ride. "The extraction point is still 3 miles away," Reed said, looking directly at Lena. And now you're carrying Vance's pack, too. He's dead for the rest of this exercise. He's a liability. Lena, you're in command. Get them home. Vance didn't protest. He handed his heavy pack to Lena. She took it, shouldering the massive weight without a word. She looked at the horizon, found the North Star, and started walking. She wasn't fast, but she didn't stop. And for the first time, the entire team followed her lead, matching her slow, unbreakable pace. The final 3 miles were the hardest thing any of them had ever experienced. The ground was a sheet of black ice, and the air was so cold it felt like breathing in tiny shards of glass. Lena was carrying a weight that should have crushed her. Between her own gear, the extra emergency supplies, and Vance's heavy pack, she was lugging nearly 130 pounds. Her legs were shaking. Her vision was starting to tunnel. But she didn't look at her feet, and she didn't look at the sky. She focused on the rhythm. Step, breathe, step, breathe. Behind her, the rest of the team moved in a daze. They were no longer the proud, chest-thumping athletes who had arrived at the base weeks ago. They were humbled. They watched Lena's back, using her steady movement as a beacon. Whenever someone stumbled or felt like quitting, they looked at the smallest person in the group carrying the most weight, and they found the strength to keep going. They reached the extraction point just as the first light of dawn turned the sky a bruised purple. A single black helicopter sat idling on a flat plateau. Commander Reed was standing by the open side door, his jacket billowing in the rotor wash. One by one, the candidates collapsed into the grass near the landing zone. They were finished. They had nothing left. Lena was the last to arrive. She walked to the edge of the plateau, unbuckled the heavy straps, and let the pack slide to the ground. She didn't collapse. She stood there for a moment, her hands on her knees, taking deep, ragged breaths. Reed walked over to her. The noise of the helicopter was a dull roar in the background. He looked at the pile of gear she had carried. Then he looked at her. "The exercise is over," Reed said. "The trucks are coming for the others. You get in the chopper." Lena looked back at her team. Vance was sitting on the ground, wrapped in a space blanket, looking at her with a mix of awe and shame. He gave her a small, tired nod. He knew now that being the best in the gym didn't mean anything if you didn't have the soul to match it. Lena climbed into the helicopter. Reed sat across from her as the machine lifted off, tilting away from the mountain and soaring toward the ocean. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Lena watched the rugged terrain disappear beneath them. "You failed almost every drill," Reed said, breaking the silence. "If I go by the book, I have to wash you out today. The paperwork says you aren't fast enough, you aren't strong enough, and you don't meet the physical profile of a special operator." Lena looked at him, her face calm, even in her exhaustion. "I know, but," Reed continued, leaning forward, "the book was written by people who think war is a track meet. They think the person who can do the most pull-ups is the person who will survive a week behind enemy lines with no food and no backup. I've been in this business 30 years, and I know the truth." He pulled a file from the seat next to him. It wasn't her training record. It was a new folder with a gold seal on it. "In the village, you were invisible because you understood people. In the storm, you were a leader because you understood the environment. And on that mountain, you were a warrior because you understood that the mind controls the body, not the other way around." He opened the folder. Inside was a single sheet of paper. It was a transfer order, but the destination was blank. "I'm not sending you to a standard unit," Reed said. "I'm putting you in a specialized cell that operates in the gray spaces, the places where we can't send a whole squad of loud, fast men. I need people who can fail a drill but win a war." I need people who know how to wait, how to watch, and how to survive when everything goes wrong. Lena looked at the paper. Why me, sir? There were others who were more elite. Reed smiled, a real, genuine smile this time. Because when the storm hit, you didn't ask for help. You became the help. Most people spend their lives trying to show the world how strong they are. You spent your time preparing for the moment the world shows you how weak you are. That's the difference. The helicopter began its descent toward a secret naval base tucked into a hidden cove. As they landed, a group of high-ranking officers stood waiting on the tarmac. They were looking for the star of the class, expecting to see a giant of a man step off the helicopter. Instead, the door opened, and Lena stepped out. She was covered in mud, her uniform was torn, and she looked small compared to the men around her. But as she walked across the pavement, the officers went quiet. There was something in her eyes, a cold, steady light that commanded respect. Vance and the others arrived by truck an hour later. They were being processed for graduation into the regular units. As they stood in line, they saw Lena standing on the far side of the base, dressed in a clean, dark uniform with no markings. She was talking to a group of men who looked like they lived in the shadows. Vance walked over to the fence, watching her. He realized then that Lena hadn't been failing the drills because she couldn't do them. She had been operating on a completely different level. She wasn't competing with them. She was preparing for a world they weren't even ready to see. Commander Reed walked up behind Vance. She's going somewhere you can't follow, son. I know, Vance said quietly. She was never one of us, was she? No, Reed replied, watching Lena walk toward a small, unmarked plane. She was exactly what we were looking for. We just had to wait for the world to get hard enough for her to show us. Lena reached the steps of the plane. She paused for a second and looked back at the training grounds. She thought about the grinder, the cold pool, and the screaming instructors. She didn't feel anger or pride. She just felt ready. She stepped into the plane and the door closed. A few minutes later, the aircraft took off, disappearing into the vast blue sky. To the rest of the world, she was just a candidate who couldn't pass a single drill. But to the few who knew the truth, she was the most dangerous weapon the country had, the woman who survived when the best fell apart. She had passed the only test that actually mattered, the test of reality.